Hello, I'm Dale Leftwich with RealAgriculture. Today I was at a seminar on seed royalties provided by the University of Saskatchewan. I'm with Richard Gray, University of Saskatchewan professor. How are you doing today, Richard?
Very good, thank you.
Well, this is a very interesting and timely discussion that you have. You have a couple of other people working with you, and you're really working on this idea of how research into open pollinated varieties and non-novel trait varieties can really be pursued. Why did you decide to do this work?
It's strictly a result of the national consultations. There's a lot of the federal government is asking the question, what kind of royalty models do producers support? And every time it's really a complex issue, so I think it's important to collect as much evidence as you can, share that information, and we thought this would be an opportunity to do that. So when I knew these consultations were going on, we decided to pursue this.
So you attended a couple of these consultations, I guess?
Yes, that's right. I was at two of them in Saskatoon, actually.
And you found that there were quite a few farmers that were expressing their opinions fairly strongly, I think.
That's for sure. There was a lot of, I'd say, pushback is maybe an understatement. There certainly some producers had a lot of reservations. They came in many different forms. Everything from I shouldn't pay anymore, I wouldn't mind paying anymore if it goes to public research. I'm worried about losing control. I'm worried about losing the levy-funded research or the checkoffs. So there was a lot of concerns producers raised, yes.
So you took you paid attention and listened to these concerns, I guess, and then that's kind of how you decided to form your research?
Yeah, that's largely it, because as long as there's a lot of resistance by producers, there's very little chance that these models will actually get to be implemented. So I think it's important that we come up with a solution that's able to address the producer producer concerns that will enable the industry to capture the returns that we can get if we invest some more.
So were there some particular things that came up at the meetings that you really wanted to tackle?
Yes, one of them was this idea of producers were worried about if they created a value creation model that particularly the federal government would decide that they were going to get out of public breeding and leave it up to the private industry. And in other countries that have implemented these models, they've very much used public producer partnerships that are then brought in private firms as well. Australia's got some good examples. So that was one thing we addressed, this need that as part of a funding model, you also need this idea that you have to create partnerships so that you keep producers at the table when it comes to value creation models. So
you looked at there were two different proposals. One was an endpoint royalty, and the other was a trailing royalty. So how did you decided to look at which one would be best for the industry?
That's right. We looked at those two. Of the two, we thought it was really important to have a royalty system that's efficient, meaning that it's low cost, and it's also effective in the sense that producers would have to pay it, if you like, if it was on a product. And on those measures, endpoint royalties came out as much cleaner. The Australian system, you pay one royalty, and that's at the time you deliver the product that you've grown from a variety. You just declare the variety at an elevator, and they deduct the royalty at that time. It's straightforward and simple, low transaction costs. On the other hand, the farm save seed, the trailing royalty model, which is the other one we looked at, requires a lot of different transactions. After the farmers purchases seed in the second year, they have to indicate which varieties they intend to grow and may use farm save seed for, and after they've seeded, then they have to indicate how much farm save seed they used, or perhaps how many acres they've seeded. And once they submit that, then they'll be invoiced for the varieties that they grew, the farm safe seed. And that means a lot of paperwork, or at least a lot of electronic transactions for hundreds of thousands of farmers. That's going to be very expensive and difficult to enforce. And if you actually want to figure out what a farmer did do on their farm, you have to do an on-farm visit, and that itself would be expensive. So we think it's expensive and it's unnecessarily complicated and difficult, whereas the endpoint royalty is a pretty efficient way to do that.
So what were the countries that you decided to study to compare to see if which ones had the best process to fund the research?
We looked at the countries that were basically had some role for the private sector in wheat breeding, which is an open pollinated crop. And so we looked very briefly at United States, we looked at Australia, we looked at France and the UK. We've had other studies we didn't report on today that looked at Germany and some of the other European countries, but France and the UK capture those dimensions. So of those four models, if we look at United States, they passed plant breeders' rates legislation, but they didn't do anything sort of systematically to create a new royalty system. As a result, nothing's happened really in the United States. They basically have a model where they rely on state checkoff systems matched with USDA money, and occasionally they'll get a private partner into one of these small programs, but not much has happened. It's basically still a public producer funded system at a very low level. United Kingdom, they tried to privatize their system, and that turned out to be disastrous. They had one big public breeding system that provided 80% of the market. They were already collecting enough royalties to fully fund that system, and the government decided they were going to sell that public breeder off to the private to Unilever, and they did for $200 million. To make a long story short, Unilever wasn't able to make the investments that they should have. They sold it to Monsanto, and today there's 6 relatively small companies competing for an underfunded research system. So it's really become fragmented, and most people would say the UK system failed after that happened. So that's not a model we want to use. France has been relatively effective. They've had a system that's remained a large public role. They've got some medium-sized private firms involved, and they have an endpoint royalty system there that's what they call a uniform system, where all wheat varieties have the same royalty attached to them. It's simple, but it's, if you like, it requires a large continued public presence, and the one feature of that system, there's 2 features that are desirable. The first feature is that when they implemented that system, the royalties started right away. So there was no phase-in period. They could basically, next year they could implement the royalties across all the wheat varieties, which meant it generated money right off the bat. The second feature is the royalty rate itself is negotiated between farm groups and the seed industry each year. So it's actually a lot of control of the producers in setting that rate. The downside is that the companies involved don't have a say in what their varieties are sold for. So it's a different system, and if you like, more public and more controlled than what some people have in mind here. Australia is by far the most effective system, I think. They first of all have a very strong levy funding, where there's a checkoff, a 1% checkoff on the sale of 27 grains that goes into one pot, and that's matched by a 0.5% levy from the government. So that means there's $200 million that's in control of producers, and they've used that. That was introduced in 1988, and they've used that to develop the whole wheat research breeding system in Australia. So really strong levy base, government matching, so they've got public and producers there. And they've also introduced endpoint royalties, and that started in 1994. And every breeder could, when they sold a variety, they could set a royalty rate on it. those royalties were initially at a low rate because they're competing against free varieties that were out there. Slowly those royalty rates came up. Right now they're about $4 per ton on the grain that's sold. As a result of that, they're now generating about $50 million a year in royalties, which is about 10 times as much as we generate in Canada. And so they now have a breeding system. The companies in that system are actually not per se private firms. They're public producer private partnerships. So they have public shareholders like state of Southern Australia, for example. The GRDC, or the one that collects the producers collect the levies, are shareholders. A university is a shareholder, and then a Limagrain is a shareholder in AGT, for example. So they've got these partnerships, very well funded. That takes care of the breeding. That leaves the other $200 million to fund upstream research and all the agronomics and other things they need to fund. I think they've got the Cadillac system that if we work hard, we might get there in 20 years.
So when you came up, we went through all of these different choices, and you were using the objections that you had heard from farmers. What kind of recommendations then did you ultimately come up with for the way forward?
Three things. The first would be to adopt the endpoint royalty model like Australia. It's by far the most lowest cost to implement and the most effective. The second would be to create public producer partnerships and invite private firms into those partnerships as they get established. Those two are really important. And the last is to, if producers are going to pay royalties, pay checkoffs, to think about government matching of those checkoffs. Right now, the producers that pay a checkoff get a rebate from the government. Those same resources could be used instead to match the producer contribution to make a bigger pool to invest on behalf of producers. So that'd be the third change we'd make.
So now that you've come up with these recommendations, is there a way to get them to people who can actually take them to decision makers? Where does that go from here?
Well, I have been speaking to a lot of groups about this, and it certainly will be submitting this to the federal government. They have electronic consultations. This discussion is, I would like to think it's near the end, but I think we've got another few months or a year to go at least, and these discussions will feed into the process. And hopefully some of these ideas will get some traction, and we'll be able to provide more resources for crop breeding.
Very good. Well, I really want to thank Professor Gray for being with us here today on Real Agriculture. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.